everyone. Thank you for attending our second panel this afternoon. Keep eating lunch while we have the panel. But I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Wes Taylor and Nour Arafat. So Wes Taylor, I'll introduce them both. Wes Taylor is an artist, designer, musician, and educator with roots in the Detroit hip hop community. He's held positions at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, and I believe is currently at Wayne State University in Detroit. His online bios describe him as both multidisciplinary and antidisciplinary, and I love that. He's a co-founder of lots of creative collectives, including Emergence Media and Talking Dolls of Detroit, and he's also on the steering committee for the Design Justice Networks. Nour Arafat is an artist, poet, writer, designer, community organizer based in Chicago. She has a art book called Desire Memory, and is the co-founder of IWA, the Chicago-based Swana community. She's also on the steering committee for the Design Justice Networks, and is one of the facilitators for the Design Justice Network's Chicago node. I'm really interested to hear their talk today about the Design Justice Network, the principles. The network has been around for almost 10 years now, maybe more than that, depending on how you count it. The Design Justice Network, as we all know, is committed to the design, to rethinking the design process in order to center, sustain, heal, and empower people who are usually marginalized by design. They'll be talking to us today about this community and how the principles driving this movement intersect with AI developments, both inside the academy and beyond. Please welcome me, join me in welcoming Wes Taylor and Nour Arafat.
Should we start with a little bit of a talk? I guess where to begin. So the network itself is, like, as you mentioned, around 10+ years old. But I think that what's bringing us here today and a lot of the context that we're carrying forward, well, there's a few. We're coming off of like running a series of discotheques. And I think a lot of you might have already received an invitation to that tomorrow. So that's one thing, and we'll get into what that means and how excited we are about what we've got going on that front. Another is we've been working through how the design justice principles can be used to shift power in the creation of community technology. So of course, this could include AI, but this also just kind of goes beyond and is meant to really transform what we conceptualize as technology. So going as far as to think of poetry as a communication technology, all the way to woodworking as technology, right? And I think that another thing that's really important to draw in this moment is we continue to reflect on this question that was posed by Jimmy Boggs and Grace Lee Boggs around what time is it on the clock of the world. And in this analysis, I think is where is best to start for today, because it grounds us in this moment and the truth of what is being experienced in the world. And that this is a time that's particularly marked by a very intense and horrific genocide. And one that is actually powered by AI as well, right? This has been proven time and time again, and we've known this since it started. Not only is it a time of genocide, it's a time of rising fascist sentiment all across the world. And it's a time in which I think, a lot of folks here are probably experiencing it, where funding and landscapes around what access we have to particular material resources beyond money, this goes to fights as deep as water and food justice, are getting increasingly critical for our communities by the day, to be quite honest. So I wanted to root us in that moment, but also provide that we're looking at how design justice, and not just design justice, but many other movements at this time, and movements that informed the creation of design justice, are responding to this moment. And this includes everything from mutual aid networks to, grassroots movements that don't rely on big funders, to people coming together in ways like we are trying to make happen this weekend, where knowledge sharing and skill sharing and these intentional spaces are created with a focus on access so that people can get together and actually practice and talk about these concepts. So I'll stop there and yes, hand it on to you.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, for that grounding and, you know, almost like level setting of like, you know, where we're going. This is not attached to anything, is it?
No,
Okay,
it's not.
okay.
It's just-
So I think what we could do is try to talk some of our history. All right, like, so some of the history, kind of where we come from, the histories and some of the legacies that we are directly informed by, some of the things that we pull, and then some of the things that we are connected to. And to see that, like, see about like how Nour and my works can, or our offering here can help inform this space through questions and things like that. So it's not necessarily gonna be a talk to everybody. It'll be participatory in the best way that it can. So, design justice comes out of a space in Detroit. And I want to make this really important because the information and the legacies are based on like geography, one, and the people within this geography that inform this, and the organizing legacies that come out of this geography. So Nour brought up two very important people to all kinds of Detroit cultural movements, I will just say, all the way from education to music to the arts to technology. So Grace and Jimmy Boggs were a power couple of philosophers and activists and organizers. And so they both theorized about a lot of things that would happen in the future. And they were using the context of their very long lives. Grace lived to be 100 years and 100 days, years old. She'd seen many different movements from translating, which I think is really important, like translating and distributing Marxist text from Europe, bringing it back to the Americas. She was really important and instrumental in doing that. All the way to as a child of Chinese immigrants, to be involved in many Black power movements, all the way from like Black Panther movements to housing and civil rights in Chicago, to working with CLR James in writing and being a thought partner in the Caribbean. And so brought all this knowledge back to Detroit and spent her time there, where she actually ended up being crucial to like a lot of organizing thought. But also her husband, Jimmy, who also lived a very long life and philosophized, like creating philosophy around this idea of work and labor. Coming from the Great Migration from Alabama to Detroit, spending a lot of time in factories in Detroit. He theorized and has many really good, both of them have very, I would say, important books. But one of his lines of inquiry was the future of work, and the theorization of, you know, work not existing anymore. And so he really took this from a standpoint of working in the factories and seeing how automation was impacting communities at that time and place, and then brought it into a racial justice, but also economic lens of like how these impacts would be made. So I've spent a little time on them because they're very influential on like the spaces where design justice comes from, where we originate in a space called the Ally Media Conference, and it's also run by this organization called Ally Media Projects. which comes from like media organizing around, I would say, a very like humble beginning from like punk zine fairs all the way to like talking about media in all kinds of expansive ways over its very long history of over 2 decades of being in operation. And so within the Allied Media Conference, we were able to organize around a lot of concepts. One would be gaming, and we come out of a gaming track where one of the co-founders, Una Lee, and a couple other people, Nina Bianchi, organized these mini conferences within the conference around design and games, where Una was impacted by Gamergate directly and was one of the targets of Gamergate. And so she created a lot of context and frameworks around consent and consent within tech, consent within game, consent within the representation of the human body in a digital world or digital environments. So that informs us. We also come out of the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition, who organized during the conference, and they work a lot through this idea of access to the internet, and we've been working through that through mesh networks and figuring out how those things can happen and how those can create access to people in Detroit where internet access is still an issue. And also, we were informed by and in direct connection with the movement for Black Lives. Prestige Colors was actually very influential to very early times where we would actually talk about these ideas before design justice actually existed within this space. And so, like there are many other threads that like inform where we came to as a group of practitioners at this conference, who included architects, urban planners, like community organizers, graphic designers, experience designers, people working within tech on a lot of different levels, creative technologists. And we all kind of came together to talk about like the state of design and its impact on culture 10 plus years ago, and what was happening, what we thought were trends, but also a noticing from a lot of practitioners who had roots within like community organizing and in the practice of design and technology, and knowing that from the industry side, this big disconnect between the industry and what they knew from like their organizing work and what they were doing in community. And some of these disconnects had to do with like language and rhetoric. And part of it was, as they were trying to explore these two parts of their lives professionally, they started to come across terms such as human-centered design. They started to come across terms such as data-informed design. They started to come across terms such as design thinking. And when they started to dig and interrogate these frameworks, this language, they started to realize that actually what was being professed by these disciplines or these subgenres within design was not rooted in an analysis around change making in society and community. And so they realized what this disconnect was when you say human-centered design, there's something rhetorical around that, but it's not rooted in anything that was meaningful based on their experience. But then when they were understood this idea of like community organizing and knew like what some of these disciplines could inform each other, and the power that it could present, then we came back to like interrogate what was happening, see what was useful, what was not useful, but then also realizing what was happening at the time was there was a movement to pull these disciplines away from this idea of politics. and just a political analysis. And so if you were to go on Google at this time and you ask, what are the principles of design? They would all be formal. So if anybody knows anything about like, art or laying things out or the visual plane, they would all be related to composition, right? Balance, contrast, hierarchy, right? Like all these things which are very based in aesthetics and formal, that at that time of the practice it felt sort of intentional, right? Because some people asking about the principles of design were maybe looking for those answers, right? What actually formally and aesthetically I can approach this. But other people also realize that like these practices, even if you had a critique around, say, if I'm going to stay with like say graphic design, which is my discipline, but understanding the Bauhaus, and understanding that the Bauhaus was a political movement. If you go back before that, the futurist movement, whichever critique, these were aesthetic movements that were informed by politics, right? And at this time, aesthetic movements were not being informed by politics, and it was not understood amongst the general population, and Google definitely did not understand that. So what we decided to do is to think about like, what is this concept of like, and how could manifesto writing inform new ways to practice design, or going back to these histories and these legacies. And so in creating principles, we were basically going through the practice of creating a manifesto. How do you attach sound, community building, advocacy, sound, like activism, organizing principles with design, and being very clear that there's a political undertone to when we say these things, and standing firm on these ideas, or also exploring and reintroducing the idea of politics back to these disciplines. And so at the same time, we were also in connection with, and our information, we were Algorithmic Justice League. We had like very much origins and roots within that. Sasha Cassandra Sharp, which was one of our steering committee members and colleagues, was a key organizer of Algorithmic Justice League at the same time we were organizing Design Justice, and the network. So the other thing that I also want to say is at this time, to kind of wrap this portion up, because this is not necessarily an exhaustive like history, but like maybe just a way to explain kind of where we're coming from or what we could provide in this conversation, is that when we talk about like pushing back and these ideas of like the bias, and when we talk about all the things that are embedded, we were also very much talking about who's included when these technologies take hold, or who's in the source code. Understanding that source code is political, right? And we can understand how political source code is just when you start to talk about these technologies from an African context, right? Is how big of a mountain it is to engage with these when you're talking about culture and these technologies, right? And so I think that's really important that we were really advocating for, same as, like Joy Bulamwani and like, other folks like in this space, right? Trying to see like how can, beyond like this idea of representation, when you're informed by, when you're building technology on computer vision, and computer vision is very limited in what it can see, and that limitation in what it can see and recognize is mostly probably because the people and the skin tones or whatever it needed to see, if we were talking about like just seeing humans and humanity, right? We're not in the room when that was fully developed. We know that that technology does not get remade, right? It's already established, it's already standardized. To go back and remake those technologies means a lot of resources. So really it's copied and pasted, right? Right into the next set of technology. And in probably perpetuity until, you know, until there's an effort for that type of cleanup, right? And then how does that end back in the stream? So that source code is there forever, that imprint is there forever. And I think we're seeing the ramifications of those like known limitations, or whether they were intentional or not. And some of them could be very intentional, some of them could be very, but the impact ends up being the same. And so we end up now like creating analysis around impact, harm, benefit, who's in the room informing it. And then these are like the basis of like how design justice works with the 10 principles, which are statements and, you know, could also be questions, right? And so do we want to like, I don't know, even talk through the principles, or?
I put them in the
Okay,
Zoom.
okay, cool, perfect.
You know, there are 10 different principles, so I think.
They're 10. And so the other thing is like, just to go back, there were time and place, right? That's what they were relevant to, what people were reacting to, the industry, society, culture, 10 plus years ago, right? They have not been updated since then. And I don't think because they are actually like evergreen like ideas, it's just that we haven't come back around. They actually probably need new interrogation or like new like analysis. But as of right now, they still work. I think, and we've understood over the years some of the limitations through, which I think is appropriate from the last conversation, is through translation. Every time we try to translate the principles to another language, we realize like on one end, how much they were informed by a time and place, but also in translation, how much these things grow and these ideas become like analyzed and more colored through new language and translation, and how we understand like how things slip from place to place when you start to use like these language to talk about how to inform, I don't know, like responsible practices around technology or design or creativity. So yeah, I'll stop there. Do you have anything?
I mean, I think I'm interested in people's questions and like getting this to be a bit more. Like what's calling to people to like know more about in this moment we went through.
Sarah, did you want to begin with a few words, or do you just want to open things right up?
We can open things up. I have questions I can ask if anyone else does, but I don't know.
I wouldn't, mine's not a question, it's a little bit extra framework to what Nour and Wes just said, since this is the POST-INSITITUte. Most of you were not at the Institute, although the entire thing is archived. You can literally watch the whole 2 weeks of talks, and it's a good listen. So I think that the idea of putting together design justice with AI, though probably not something that is unique to a group of people that got together to write a grant, certainly was done by a group of people who wanted to write a grant. And it came out of a strong sense of inspiration. I had been, I found out about Sasha Constanza Chalk's book, which talks a lot about Design Justice Network and the principles. I started teaching the principles, Because up until that point, various kinds of design theory had kind of left me cold for the reasons that you said. When we took the idea of the merger of design justice principles as a way of looking at AI in particular to Pretoria, we thought we might be ready to sit in a room as a group of fellows. We had about, I forget the exact number, 13 or 14 emerging fellows, keynotes, organizers that were at Pretoria. So we thought we might be ready to be in a room and say, do we need some additional principles or some reworked principles that are particular to how to deal with AI technologies? And it was really interesting because the question was sort of quickly set aside by the question of whether we had done enough work to actually to be sensitive enough to where the design justice network principles had come from historically to do that. And, you know, and I felt alive to that because I knew what my own work had been. I am a member of the Design Justice Network for what that's worth, $10 a month to them. But, you know, so it's, you know, there's a question of like, who owns the principles and how should they be talked about? Was it up to a self-appointed group that happened to have gotten 2 grants, one now canceled, by putting design justice together with AI? Was it up to that self-selected, self-appointed group to begin that work? And so we were happy to leave that as an open question, delay any work of codifying anything. And this is, you're now in an after conversation in which we continue to think about that. Is that a good way of putting it?
Yeah, that's cool.
Comment. I was introduced to the design justice framework through Lauren, and I, 3 years ago now, I guess I immersed myself for a while in it. And I had to give a lecture at Wesleyan, talk about whatever I wanted, and at that time I was like in this stuff. And I looked at Wesleyan University's you know, statements about themselves and what their goals are and all that, and they put design very prominent there. I don't know if you've ever looked at their website, right? On their website, and they say something like design can be a form of critique. So, oh, wow, you know. So I guess I have a question for you about where you see yourselves intersecting with secondary education in this country. Like, I mean, I think Lauren's concern was like, oh, who am I suddenly to think I'm gonna intervene and, you know, and offer something, or even inviting you in and then offering something, right? But there is this educational part. I mean, I was actually, I ended up being quite critical about that with the university profession, but at the same time, it's very attractive to our teaching.
For sure.
Right? So where does that intersection happen? How do you see yourselves playing a role in an environment which will often not invite you right in, right? I'm assuming.
I mean, I have an answer, but I'm curious.
I think we probably both have answers that inform each other. I can start with mine. And I'm gonna pull it back a little bit to some work that me and Wes were doing last year around, we'd received a grant through UCLA. And it was a grant that was given to 5 regional workshops around these concepts of innovation, culture, and creativity, for whatever these big words are worth. And one of the things that they asked for us to do as part of these regional workshops was to define what an innovation ecosystem is. And so a lot of folks in these workshops, I think, we're pretty focused on what we traditionally are taught. I don't know how many folks in here might have been have gone to engineering school. Cool. All right, great.
So
I did
has
too.
Nour.
But you know, you get taught a lot about like really particular design processes and like ways that R&D work that are pretty industrial. And a lot of people replicated this model in a sense, and what they presented as an innovation ecosystem. And universities tend to fit in this as either a hub for research or a way to professionalize people so that they're ready to engage in this framework. When we think about how design justice is really getting practiced at its like in a way that's like true, feels truer to the origins and the history, the university is actually not really found in this innovation ecosystem. When we name places, we're naming community centers, we're naming someone's garage where they made up a home studio, we're naming independent performance spaces, we're naming people who identify as creative workers, producers, entrepreneurs, poets, farmers, and we're looking at resources where you're actually able to work with, things that are owned and controlled by the people who are making and creating and putting these spaces together. And so I think by definition, the university, like it's like pushing the university to the side is what we're trying to do. Or I wouldn't say what we're trying to do, but like what a lot of these design processes that actually can practice these principles, where they would exist. I say that, and I want to add this caveat that I think that, me and Wes end up in a lot of universities to give talks and panels like this. We give workshops like this. We do like day-long workshops sometimes where we like carry people through principles and stuff. So I say that, and then I'm also like, and also we're in the university, and people have been teaching this in their classes now for like the last like 8 to 10 years since the principles have been online on the website. And I think that, Wes can speak to this a bit more, but now what we've seen is like, it's been 10 years since these principles are out, and they've shifted the conversation about design. Like a lot of folks know about the design justice principles that did not know about them 8 years ago. And part of that is happening in classrooms. And also, we're not a part of the institutions, like a lot of us have come up in them, so I can't deny that either.
Yeah. I mean, and then to add to that, which I think just reinforces that, is like, I think one thing that we're protective about the history of something, like the origins, and one, I think, sense of pride, where I've been an academic for, almost the same time that these have been out, right? But one of the things that we hold on to is that the principles did not come out of academia. This was knowledge creation that had nothing to do with the university. And so like, I feel really protective and proud of that. Like, it's a thing that is like created outside of these spaces that's influenced these spaces. And generates what the conversation goes on. So the thing is like, some of that protection is to be like, yeah, but we need these spaces of knowledge creation. We need this interchange. Like, we need this type of influence, because what ended up happening, right, is for us to generate, like, these principles are not peer reviewed, right? They didn't go to a journal to say that these are like, that these are like, I don't know, valid, had the validation in the stamp of the academy, right, for them to be important. A lot of these principles, like, well, this is, I think, a prime example of embodied knowledge being validated in these spaces, and like understanding that, like, if people didn't know that embodied knowledge was important, well, if they come across these, then they know. You know what I mean? It's like, and so I think it's like this there's this counter conversation of like where knowledge comes from, where it's sourced, and how it can work its way through any of these spaces, and not to be completely going back to my, concern or conversation with Vukosi and Happy is this idea is like being co-opted completely, which the university has the ability to do, right? To make people forget that knowledge can happen outside of these walls.
Before the university is then co-opted,
Yeah.
and in the chain of co-optations.
One of the areas that I want to kind of check in on, because I was part of like getting some of the students created hackathons and they built a really incredible culture around that. And then I co-founded the Rutgers Makerspace and I have a community space as well. But the thing that was happening there was the students would come to the space, this is your project, you're in charge of it, we facilitate, we have tools, we have knowledge, we'll act as like the physical library of resource. And we kind of were a space that helped solve problems that departments couldn't solve because they may not have the right tools or whichever, but they still have the expectations of solution.
Mm-hmm.
And the students themselves would use it as innovation space. Some of them started their own companies, came up with their startup ideas. And then, what we didn't have is we didn't give them a design justice point of view. I think the students brought a lot of experience that when they said, hey, how do I make this relevant? Discover some of the elements of the design justice components.
Yeah.
So I think there are these really incredible innovations, but I think the students and the community that they form and those networks are really key to it because it's a response to the structure that the university is providing.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I'm glad that it's those things are starting to come through because I think, I was implying this earlier, but I didn't say this explicitly, but a lot of design justice was also in reaction to tech culture, and tech vernacular, right? And tech expectations to how things happen in the world. So it was to be really crass, it was a lot of people were burnt out by being around a whole bunch of tech bros trying to solve the world's problems. And you're like, no, this is not where this is gonna happen, right? And so, but also I think, when you bring up maker spaces, right? I do think the tech startup angel funding, industrial complex, if you want to call it that, right, is very much, they found there's a place where it's seated at these points of origin or where people are finding technology, right? And then how, once again, just saying, but I do think this idea of indoctrinating people in this idea of angel investment through innovation.
Right.
So there was sort of an allergic reaction to how innovation can happen in how it's understood.
For instance, we have one of the innovative business science found out they were oh, you've got a makerspace. Well, now my channel of innovation now fits putting a makerspace in it. So then it's sort of you're kind of just part of the system and people aren't challenging the system or thinking of it in that way.
Yeah.
And then the ingredients that students are working with, because now we've got AI as a big ingredient in all of these things. So it changes the nature of what that system is.
Mm-hmm.
You want to ask your questions?
Yeah, so one question I had was just about the language, especially that's in the principles, and you've talked a lot about how the principles are informed sort of outside of both universities and sort of industrial tech world context. I wonder to what extent you all feel that that now, maybe in the last year or so, that these kinds of principles are not just outside of the mainstream, but are sort of being targeted explicitly, that puts a target on your back.
Yeah.
And to what extent the community needs to address this, or what ways of addressing this. I was also wondering if you had more to say about the notion of human-centered design and the way that that sort of neuters and sort of defangs any kind of community organizing.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go that quick and then maybe we'll start at the end and then. So I mean, I feel like that was at a certain time, I was like my personal analysis to like how I was understanding human-centered design in its combination, like in its connection to this idea of big data, right? And I think it also like goes back to like this origin of like this positivism that I think Lauren brings up a lot, right? Where human-centered design I was feeling like was being seen as and given a place or this status of the ability for tech and design solutionism to be unquestioned. And the people that present these things be unquestioned when they're in the room, right? And so that was one of my critiques around human-centered design, because it was like, well, yeah, how do you argue with any of those words, right? Like when I say it's like a rhetorical thing, that was one of the things, and pull those things apart. And to go back to, once again, reference Lauren, is this idea of like bring design justice and AI together, right? Well, also rhetorically, we're bringing design and justice together as concepts, right? And then those don't like have they're not a stabilizing thing when you put those two words together, right? So all kinds of things. So this could go into, the second part of the conversation. But what I observed about human-centered design was, I recognized it when we go back to like this idea of co-option as this, I don't know, instrumentalizing this idea of intersectionality, but for industry, right? So prior to human-centered design practice, right, and the design thinking and the places this was coming out of, such as, like an IDEO or other like places like that. I don't actually know that IDEO was so concerned with the change of society so much that they tapped into something that could sell things to people way more efficiently, right? And so when you start to talk about intersectional data points, to being like, well, before we were just selling to like white men and we did all right, but then you realize that you can like identify somebody to present something, an advertisement back to them based on who they are, and that's way more efficient and effective. Well, I would say that that's borrowing, the scholarship and the philosophy of like, the people that were really figuring out like intersectional scholarship, right? And turning that back into a way to like sell and advertise. And so like, but I also thought like the residue of the application, and I was like, oh yeah, but this can be used in medicine, you know what I mean? Or this could be used to treat people directly. But I think those were like afterthoughts to being like, oh, we can make a Nike commercial, or we can have people like straight up and down design their own Nikes, right? To fit everything that they need or their desires or whatever. So that was my personal critique and analysis around that, which still has a little bit more to it, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So maybe the other further question about design justice networks having a target on their back.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think that it's really important, actually, let's connect it to the part of the question that Wes just answered around human-centered design. So there's also a part of the history to human-centered design where it's an evolution of machine-computer interface design. And that for a really long time, a lot of these design processes were really focused on machines, right? And so that was also part of the novelty of adding the word human to it. And so in doing that, there's no actual systematic critique that's happening here. There's no critique in human-centered design around equity or participation or who's involved in the process. That's not a part of this paradigm. And when you're with design justice, that's one of the distinguishing factors, is like we've come out more or less as a political organization. So it's it's like we are speaking as people, and like these principles are created in ways so that they can help people or support people who are working within design frameworks, however that might mean. And we think of design, maybe let's take it back. We think of design in a very open way. It's not just the like trademark graphic designer, right? We're talking about like the event producer who's also a DJ who spends all their time making sure that the event is crafted with care, and they're really thinking about the needs of the people that are gonna be coming in from the hours of 8 PM all the way to 3 AM, right? Like there is a design justice element in creating something like these spaces. So I just wanna bring it back to like how, encompassing this design definition is too, and I think that's a difference from that. So we're looking at design and we're placing this kind of contradictory statement of design and justice together, and we are talking about systematic inequities that are affecting design processes. So that means that we're talking about racial capitalism. That means we're talking about the horrific genocide. That means that we're talking about the pipelines and various environmental disasters that affect everything from Puerto Rico to Hawaii, right? Like these are things that we are not shying away from and that are like a distinct part of it. And because of that, you're all like, that's just like a broader part of being in movement work, is that you're just gonna be working in all these different ways of friction against the status quo, because that's kind of like that's the thing here, is you're trying to cut at these systematic inequities.
So, this question of language that has become targeted or verboten, I throw out a couple of interesting points. I just read last night somewhere in the Chronicle that at the University of Florida, a professor was telling her students not to use the word intersectional. And I'll add that when our NEH grant was canceled, a few influential people leapt to the conclusion that it was canceled because it was called design justice. In fact, they didn't even bother to get that granular. They were like, if you have an NEH grant, you did not spend all the money yet, and it was granted under the Biden administration, canceled. That was.
Unless it was about the American Revolution.
Oh, interesting.
Okay.
Interesting. But as far as the word justice goes, which, I'm quite fond of, I simply don't see how you can, I do see how you can do it. When people do things, again, they do it. They don't care about the inconsistencies, but it's worth emphasizing that it is not only in the Pledge of Allegiance, it's in the preamble to the United States Constitution. It is in fact the very first words, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, with a capital J, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So justice in that specific sense is a very American idea. And from there, the conversation begins.
Yeah,
Right.
but I mean, also, if you like ask that, based on like, is it still an American idea?
Yeah, right.
I mean, that's the question, like how it's being targeted. I mean, and like, this is kind of like, it's kind of news to us, but it's just also like, yeah, do we have like a strategy around that, which you were also asking? We don't yet. And there are other reasons as to why we haven't gotten to that point. to figure out like what it is, what does it mean to use like different language to talk about the thing that we're trying to do or say, or, create action around, right? But, and does it require these words? No, like, I'm not tied to the words design justice. The other thing that I wanted to say is just like, as we form this concept of design justice in around Detroit and around the Allied Media Conference, there were other people hashtagging this idea of design justice that were not us. There were also very early splinter groups that happened from that space, that took on different like foci or whatever. Some of them became very focused on just like the built environment and architecture. That started in that space, but like also they hashtag design justice. Other people were hashtagging design justice through the lens of like social media, right? Things like that. But I think we never wanted to treat this as intellectual property in any way, or to go back to this idea of trademarking or whatever. So that, I think that it could be, used and taken and people to resource around this concept. But then also for people to evolve it, but also like, I think being part of something that like, being part of a group of people that started a very particular, I don't know, like sub genre or category around this larger topic, and then kind of established itself and is recognized as a center or a source. There's also a thing that like, I guess when you talk about like going to like school, in the Biden administration, right, this is a thing that could have been exploited like 10 times over, right, by us, like, just by having membership and membership drives, writing for all kinds of grants and things like that. Like, it could have been like, almost like there was a cash grab like aspect of this, that we could have approached it in some way to like acquire resources, right? And then maybe redistribute resources. Part of that was like, it was more the ideas that were important, and maintaining like this idea of like, how do we stay true? How do people that engage with this stay kind of true to these ideas, and also not police the ideas at the same time, which is always like this negotiation. And at this moment, like, I'm not tied to the words, you know what I mean, design and justice, to like understand like the principles that are behind them are actually the things that are in motion, and probably the evolution of these words. Yeah, so it's like the flip of being like, yeah, probably like in all actuality, right? This is of like an overt invite to a college campus that is tagged as design justice. This might be one of the last few times that we're able just to move in space like this, you know what I mean? But also, it's cool. Like, I'm also like, if we go back to, I would say, the objective that Nour brought up, when we published the principles, I think the only objective was to change the conversation around design, the industry. I feel like it's done its purpose, right? Like, I'm cool. So if the seeds of whatever happened in design justice ceases to exist, then I'm actually fine, because I think it's done a thing that it set out to do, and I would say relatively successfully. And I think at that moment, when the thing has achieved this goal, then I think there needs to be a real assessment of like why it still needs to exist, actually.
Yeah, any other contributions? Conversation?
What would it look like for design systems if people look at it like New York, like young New York Joe members, and turn that into systems or data, or just like
Okay, so that, I mean, interesting. Like, that's like a lot of different curves, but like basically you're asking like, what could a design justice approach to drill rap, right? The rappers that produce it and make it, but very specific to like New York and New York's brand of like drill rap.
Yeah, lyrics that you, like, if you listen to it, it comes off as a very, like, violent, form of, like, expression, but
Yeah,
if you read between the lines, like, these rappers are very sad, and they come from marginalized communities. And the youngest drill rapper that I know is 12 to 13 years old, so how do you take, like, a group like this, and how is design justice, like,
I mean, my immediate reaction, just like immediate, like I feel like this would take me like a day or a week to like really like think through. And it'd be interesting because it's like then like one of my close collaborators, like Mike Demps is in the room. We make music together. We've been making music, and I come from like different like underground hip hop communities. It was not drill whatsoever, but at the same time, one analysis I think, or one principle that I think could be embedded in that is this idea of like community led and community owned. So even if, right, if we view drill as being this influential, many times destructive force coming through like music, through communities, right? Like where it's tagged as in media and things like that. But also like, you know, how what it sets out to do or whatever, can at least the people making this music like own and control the narratives, the labor that goes into like the result of the labor, and then how does that get diverted from the exploitation of say of a record label, right? And so like to me that would be community ownership and control would be one thing that I would start with, and then think about like what other principles could go into it. And then I would say like, you know what, and then what would the goal be in introducing or grafting the principles on top of drill rap, right? Would it be for there to be like healing and harm reduction in that world? Is it for it to evolve in its expression? Would it be to like help people involved in that scene to grow as their taste experiences grow, or could it be for like protection against the legal system? Like these will all be questions that I would have when trying to introduce like the design justice framework to drill rap, which I also think is would be very stimulating to like think about. I don't know, is that helpful?
I think it would be cool on the aspects of trying to like get the narrative straight and to make it more like, make the point of the music into a form of resistance, which I believe that it is because it's like personal testimonies of like what they go through and they have to do. So that would be like, personally, that's what I would like focus on.
I think music is a great topic to bring us to the topic of automated technologies like artificial intelligence. Among the many collaborations that Critical AI at Rutgers have, we have a collaboration with Local 802, which is the musicians of the New York City metro area. And, you know, in ways that ordinary people probably don't think about a whole lot, they've already been very, very deeply harmed by streaming, which has been okay for record labels so far, especially the major record labels, but very bad for artists who sometimes get pittances and who have trouble connecting to their fandoms. And in ways that I just did not realize, like Spotify is the dominant tool. And it has a way of really deeply abstracting music from anything like an album or an artist or an event where this band played live, or, you know, it's, in fact, its core idea is that music is ambient and you kind of just listen to it as the soundtrack of your life. And you don't have to pay a whole lot of attention to anything, and it's sort of just like there. And they also have begun to stream a lot of AI generated music. So among many other things, you know, drill rappers are performing. And, you know, this is not necessarily a statement against AI per se, because AI means many things and it's many different technologies, but like one of the many things that is a challenge for young people growing up is to go out, you know, put this away, put the phone down, go out and see someone play music, learn how to play an instrument yourself. If you like a sound, find out about it. You know, when I was a lass, you know, it was a sign of coolness to know things about who your favorite artists were and what they did. I didn't think that could ever be flattened, but I think it has been a little.
So this is gonna be like kind of a long question, so hopefully you can riff on any of it. And answer the question that I should have asked even better. You know, so thinking about community-led design, you know, like part of empowering community is sort of the kind of organization and facilitation that gets people into the room. But there's another part that's the kind of consciousness raising or education that gives them, you know, the vocabulary to ask for what they want. You know, when I think about like participatory design of this kind, I think of the work of the architect Christopher Alexander, who's been very influential in computer science, whose kind of main goal and sort of expounding sort of participatory architecture was to give lay people language for the kinds of ingredients that they wanted, that they should want in their buildings if they're aiming for certain kinds of goals or experiences. And, you know, from our project, we're thinking a lot about critical AI literacy, where part of that has been giving people the tools to resist and critique the things that are often foisted on them by big tech. But I think, you know, we're also inspired by the Design Justice Network to give people the vocabulary to ask for what they want, right? And I wonder, like, in your thinking about technology through a design justice lens, what kind of lessons you've drawn about how to help people ask for what they want in this space?
Yeah, okay, good question.
So I think for me, like, around this question of like giving folks the languages and tools and skills to ask for what they want, this actually goes like really directly to two concepts that we touched on already: community technology and what we're doing tomorrow and Saturday with these discotheques. So community technology is a framework that also came out through the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition, and a lot of writing has been done on it by Diana Nucera, you know, Bianchi, and so many other folks, Tawana Petty. And so a lot of these come from, especially a time in Detroit, or a lot of the writings that are kind of out there come from a time in Detroit where broadband internet access was slowly being rolled out to more and more neighborhoods. And as you have that, there was also like degrees of internet literacy and digital literacy around everything from privacy and security to, you know, how to use different like what we think of as like basic digital functions. The reason I want to like speak to that is because of that kind of level setting as well around like, as designers, we could come into a community and talk about like, hey, here's this like app idea that folks have to support with X, Y, Z. Or here's this architectural idea that we'd like to think through in this neighborhood and like just get feedback. Or you could approach folks in this way that actually, I think it's actually, I don't like, yeah, it's participatory processes, but it's something a little different where it's really shifting that it's less of going in as like a designer and trying to elicit, and honestly, in a lot of cases, it becomes even extractive. Like a lot of participatory design processes are actually quite extractive. And they're just like clouded and cloaked in this participatory language of, well, we had these town halls and we had these forums and we did this focus group and we had these surveys and that's all these people's participation. But instead you take these concepts of community technology, which are rooted in the idea that the ways that we're communicating with each other and these different technologies we're building are best, like, should be and can be owned by the people using them. And so you take that and then you kind of bridge it and scaffold it with what we're talking about with discoteques, which are short for discovering technology, and have these like spaces, and this is just one example of many, where it's not about going in and asking folks like, well, what do you think about, what would your ideal neighborhood look like? Or, I don't know, these kinds of like lofty questions that often get asked in these processes too, right? Because people are like, we gotta get people thinking really dreamy and let's think 50 years, like, and we've done this, I've done this, like, you know, I'm not saying this as someone who is like not participated in some of these questions and processes, but you know, like, it's very different if like to say like, okay, we're inviting like folks that live on the street of the neighborhood to come into a room, and then we're just gonna ask them a bunch of questions. And then we're just gonna leave and we're gonna take the data and then we're gonna come back, we're gonna be like, this is what you said you wanted. As opposed to going multiple steps further, and like this stuff takes time, it doesn't just happen, of building relationships with the people that you want to build with. And not just that, but also like committing to this like other strand of things where it's like teaching people critical technology skills. So it's not just about asking what do you want, but rather taking this technology that's being used to control a lot of the parameters in people's lives and demystifying it and allowing people to critically interrogate how a smartphone is built, how internet works, how how to protect yourself on the internet. All these things that, you know, it might be knowledge that a designer of this context holds and is then going to make design decisions based on, and instead like pushing yourself to share that and make it accessible so folks can then make their own design decisions. So I don't know if that's helpful, but
I mean, it makes us sound like we're maybe more on the right track than I would have guessed.
And I mean, I would like to add the lofty side to that, right, is, I'm always just like tracing things back, but like Allied Media Conference was a place that like really enforced this idea of radical imagination, right? And I think of design justice as actually being a product of radical imagination, actually, and practicing that, and then that being in a room full of people that understood that, and put that into these things, but also I think it goes to one of the points of like why we're here, right? We're kind of stuck in a matrix of, do we engage with AI or do we not? And there's really no, there's actually, the matrix is that's not even a choice, right? But that, like, this structure that we're in is a result of somebody else's radical imagination, right? Like, we're only, it's not the AI is inevitable or was like as a result of like the sequential teleological sequence of events that got us here that was inevitable, right? It was a room of people actually thinking through these concepts, and then, you know, putting that out there in a radical, in an imagined way that was convincing, right? And so I think the flip side of it is like, we're not in the matrix of AI, we're in the matrix of somebody's like mediated, like world, or we're in a matrix of a series of movies, writings, predictions that all led us to this point that captured people's imaginations to invest their time and energy and money into these things. If these things weren't imagined or thought up or written like persuasively, then we would not be in this room, you know? And so I think that,
What
like,
if the people had read the second half of those books?
Yeah.
but here's the other thing. This is like another thing. I think cautionary tales do a big disservice because they do a very good job of imagining that world.
That's right. That's right.
That's-
So, like, in order for you to be caution somebody and to engulf somebody in that world, you have to persuade them that this exists. You've already laid the blueprint, right? Before you get to the point, right?
Right.
And so I think that, like,
Many people never get past, I know kung fu.
yeah, I mean, it's not, but it's not even that. People do get past that, right? Like, there's a portion of there's a portion of the population that pick up on, like, yeah, okay, like, let's not do that. And then there's a portion of the population that's like Skytech or Skynet. That's really cool technology, right? Like that, and that's and we're in that right now.
Yeah.
And one more thing I wanna add on to, and like kind of go back to like that question of like radical imaginings. And these points I was making around developing these like different literacies that are sharing design resources and like skills and stuff is, it actually makes it that much, like, it's no longer you going in as the designer, trying to like put together this participatory thing and coming up with your radical imagination that's like slightly informed by other folks. It's that like empowerment that then a lot of other people can not only have their own radical imaginings, but like there's something that's really powerful and I think that's been missing for a minute and is maybe making itself more prevalent now that we're in this moment of urgency that we're in. When we refer back to what time is on the clock of the world that we spoke about at the beginning, that it's this mix of radical imagining with like what's possible. And that's what we're trying to further when we like instigate these spaces, is like, you know, giving people that really like, you know, one of the folks that helped us out with the last one, we were hoping she could be here, Camelia, has described the discotheque as like an alchemizing space. And a space where all the people who had all these different really cool world building skill sets basically coming together, and then you're able to interact as like an engaged community participant, and like then your head is just like spinning because you've got someone, you just visited Treese, who taught you all about how she's working on making Wi-Fi more accessible, free Wi-Fi more accessible to the public, and how it might integrate into really cool landscape design, and like giving people some of those tools. And then you went and visited Boaz and Elijah, who like gave you a LoRa mesh network kit, and you started building like a walkie-talkie basically, that like doesn't require your phone anymore to be hooked up to service, and you can talk to someone 150 miles away via text. And then you went and you visited Arthur, and you learned how to make an advertisement using free browser-based software, so you could just go to a public library and make it. Like, your head starts swimming with the possibilities, and that's the kind of radical imaginings that we're also trying to support people in seeding for themselves.
Great.
It seems like you're talking about decentralization, right? Like the tech industry loves to use the word democratization as if their monopolistic tool that also surveils you is a way of delivering freedom. But what you're saying is that freedom is at the perimeter, it's outside of that one box that wants to lure you in with this illusion that that's where freedom lives. And I still haven't figured out why some of my friends will not get off of things that are owned by Mark Zuckerberg, but many will not. They can't imagine life without it.
Right.
I mean, it's the ease of connection right now.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, once again, like, that was like, to say that Facebook is a result of radical imagination is too charitable. Still, like, but still, like, it was the result, like,
Right.
there,
They'll to check out one's female. Kinds of.
and that goes back to the source code,
Yeah.
right? Like, you know what I'm saying, like, with the politics in the original thing that sparked it, or
Yep.
it's still there, right?
Yeah.
It's still in Facebook, it's still in Instagram.
Yeah.
Well, I would say sometimes we're facing new problems in that, because we have to radically imagine it. So for instance, the data that, the LLM is trained on totally matters, right? And
Yes.
cross language, et cetera. But the other part is the when and what information, right? So it freezes a certain amount of stuff in time with like a virtual world of knowledge.
Yeah.
And you give it a context and it builds out those expectations. But as it's gone, 6 months of new data, 6 months of new data, 6 months of new data, 2 years from now, these 2 years will be included and spouting answers back. So we actually have an interesting snapshot, like pre the current president, and we have this new whatever edited world that we're moving towards that would then be encoded in the next set or prioritized in the encoding of the next set. So it's gonna be, what do these models evolve to and who's in charge of them? And can you do anything to influence that? And will it get less just because of consuming the current information?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good question. And I can't put this all the way in practice, right? Like 100%, because of just like, where we are. But it's like a lot of times my question is, do I engage with this thing? These definitions become really blurry at a certain point, but it is like a quick check. Is this platform, was it made by the people and is it for the people? And, that's a tough question to, to define all of those things. But I also know, I can also say what clearly is not that at the same time.
Right.
Okay, this is making me think about the network part of design justice networks, and we're talking a lot about community-led, community-owned. But what about the relationship between those communities, and how do we support solidarity, especially when there's these geographic issues and other sorts of separations between the communities? What does solidarity look like in this context?
I mean, I would also like to open that up to the room if people have like ideas and thoughts around like how to create solidarity.